Millionaire is surprised by a little girl in a market who calls him and says, "I know you. Your photo is in my mother's wallet." He is shocked to discover who that girl is. David Smith, a man whose fortune allowed him to live a life of luxury and abundance, couldn't escape the shadow of deep loneliness that accompanied him daily. Success in the food industry, with his chain of markets expanding throughout the region, did not fill the void he felt. David had learned to view work as an escape, burying himself in numbers and strategic decisions that kept his empire growing. One morning, which seemed like any other, David decided to visit one of his markets, something he did infrequently, but always provided him with a sense of connection to what he had built. Upon entering the store, he was immediately recognized by the employees, who greeted him with the respect reserved for someone of his position. David, as usual, waved with a slight smile, but his mind was elsewhere, wandering through distant thoughts and memories. As he walked down the aisles, he observed the movement of customers, the full shelves, the sound of shopping carts being pushed. It was an ordinary scene, but that day something seemed different. David paused in the fresh produce section, looking without really seeing, until a soft voice caught his attention. "I know you," said the girl, a little girl with brown hair and curious eyes who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. She looked at him with an intensity that made David stop and turn fully toward her. "Excuse me?" he replied, surprised, crouching down a bit to be at the child's level. "Your picture is in my mom's wallet," the girl asserted with a confidence that seemed far beyond her age. David frowned, intrigued. "In your mom's wallet?" he repeated, trying to understand what she meant. "Yes, my mom showed me a picture of you. She said you were someone important. I think she knows you," Amanda continued, still looking at him with those eyes that seemed to examine every detail of his face. David's curiosity was immediately piqued. Who could this woman be who carried a picture of him? As he pondered, the girl continued, "My mom went to the bathroom, but she'll be back soon. Can you wait?" David felt a strange tightening in his chest, a mix of anxiety and expectation. There was something about the way the girl spoke that unsettled him. He nodded, agreeing to wait, and while he did, he tried to think of who this woman could be. Perhaps an old acquaintance, someone whose path he had crossed in the past, but a picture in a wallet. That was unusual, to say the least. Minutes seemed to drag as David waited, watching Amanda, who played distractedly with a keychain hanging from her backpack. Finally, he saw a woman approaching. She had dark, slightly wavy hair, and her brown eyes were marked by a tired but kind expression. When her eyes met David's, something inside him stirred. She stopped abruptly upon seeing him talking to Amanda, her face contorted in a mix of surprise and disbelief. David, still not fully believing what his eyes were seeing, took a step forward. "Martha?" he asked, his voice coming out softer than he intended, almost a whisper. The woman blinked several times as if trying to convince herself that it wasn't an illusion, and then, with a trembling smile, she took a few hesitant steps toward him. "David," she murmured, and before he could say anything else, Martha enveloped him in a tight embrace. It was as if time had stopped. David felt the familiar warmth of that embrace, something he hadn't experienced since childhood. That was the embrace of his sister. Amanda watched the scene without fully understanding, but hearing her mother's name mentioned by David intrigued her. "Mom, do you know him?" Amanda asked, her voice high-pitched and full of curiosity. Martha slowly released David, her eyes shining with emotion, and turned to her daughter. "Yes, Amanda. This is your Uncle David, my little brother, whom I thought I would never see again." Amanda's expression was one of total surprise, which only intensified the emotion of the moment. David, feeling a lump in his throat, could barely speak. So many questions overwhelmed him, so many emotions were pulsing in his chest. After the unexpected and emotional reunion at the market, David, Martha, and Amanda decided to leave that place, which now seemed too small to contain the emotions that were on the surface. The conversation that had started there needed more space to unfold, and Martha suggested they go to her house where they could talk more calmly. On the way, the silence in the car was broken only by a few questions from Amanda, who was still trying to process everything that had happened. David, on the other hand, was immersed in his own thoughts, while Martha watched the road with a distant look, as if she was reliving every moment of her childhood with her brother. When they arrived at Martha's small house, she invited David to sit in the modest living room, decorated simply but with a cozy touch that reflected her personality. Amanda settled on the couch next to her uncle, still curious and eager for answers. "Amanda, you are too young to fully understand, but I'm going to tell you a story," Martha began with a trembling but determined voice. She looked at David, seeking courage in his eyes, and he only nodded, encouraging her to continue. "This story is about me and your uncle when we were children." Martha took a deep breath before starting, as if she needed to organize the fragments of memory that still caused her pain. "When we were little, we lived with our mother, but it wasn't an easy life. Our mother, she had a serious problem with alcohol. It was hard for her to take care of us, and that left us very vulnerable. I was the oldest, so I always tried to protect David, but things became unbearable." She paused, her eyes lost in some point on the wall, as if reliving the most painful moments. "One day, social workers came and took us away. They said we couldn't stay with our mother anymore, that it was dangerous for us. I remember it like it was yesterday." Martha's voice faltered, and she needed a moment to compose herself before continuing. "They took us to an orphanage. I was terrified, but what scared me the most was that even there, we could be separated." David, who had remained silent until then, held his sister's hand, as if trying to convey the strength he also needed. "We were kept together for some time, but soon things changed," he said, completing the narrative. "A couple came and they wanted to adopt a child. I was small, and I guess they found me adorable. Or maybe I was just easier to take care of. They chose me, and I left." David closed his eyes for a moment, trying to push away the memory of being separated from the only family he knew. "I remember looking back and seeing Martha crying. I cried a lot too, but I was just a child and couldn't do anything." Amanda watched her mother and uncle with wide eyes, absorbing every word as if it were part of a sad tale. "And what happened to you, Mom?" Amanda asked softly, feeling the pain in her mother's voice. "I stayed at the orphanage for a while longer," Martha replied with a resigned voice. "It wasn't easy, but a few months later, another family came and adopted me. They were good people, but they took me to another city, far from everything I knew, far from David. For years I tried to adapt, but there was always a void. I thought about David every day. All I had left was a small photo of him, which I kept as a treasure." She got up and went to a small shelf, where she took out a worn wooden box. Opening it, she took out a small photo of a smiling boy with eyes full of life and hope. "This is the photo I showed you, Amanda. I've kept it with me all this time. Even when I got married and had you, Amanda, this photo was with me." Martha handed the photo to David, who held it reverently, his eyes teary as he saw the child he once was, whom Martha had so lovingly preserved. "I also tried to find you," David said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "When I reached adulthood, the first thing I did was search for information about you. But the orphanage no longer existed. I tried in various ways, but it seemed like you had disappeared from the map. I never gave up, Martha, never. But the clues were few, and time passed, until today." Martha nodded, understanding the frustration David must have felt. That moment was both a blessing and a painful reminder of all they had lost. "But now we're here," David said, breaking the silence that had settled. "And I promise, Martha, I will never leave you or Amanda again. We are a family, and we will make up for lost time." Amanda watched everything with a mixture of emotions that she was still too young to fully comprehend. But one thing she knew: her family had just expanded, and a new chapter in their lives was about to begin. David woke up the next morning after the reunion with Martha, feeling a different energy, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, but at the same time, there was a new responsibility that he embraced with all his heart: to rebuild the bond with his sister and get to know his niece, Amanda, better. During breakfast, which he had alone in his spacious apartment, David thought about the possibilities that were opening up before him. His initial instinct, as a businessman used to solving problems with concrete actions, was to offer financial help to Martha. He knew her life hadn't been easy, and he wanted to do everything in his power to ensure that she and Amanda would never have to face difficulties again. However, when he met with Martha later that day, he realized that things wouldn't be so simple. Sitting in the living room of Martha's modest home, he began to talk about his plans. "Martha, I know you've always been strong and independent, but I would like to help, truly. It doesn't make sense for you to have to struggle so much when I can do something to ease that burden." David spoke sincerely, his tone soft and concerned. Martha looked at him, a sad smile on her lips, as she considered the offer. She knew David was speaking from the heart, but she also knew how much this meant to him. Still, the pride that had sustained her all those years was hard to overcome. "I appreciate it, David, truly, but it's not that simple. I've always managed to take care of myself and Amanda, and accepting help, well, it's hard. I'm used to handling things on my own." David took a deep breath, trying to understand his sister's perspective. He didn't want to hurt her pride, but he also couldn't stand by and do nothing. "I understand, Martha, but we're in this together now. It's not about you needing help, but about me wanting to be part of your life and Amanda's. I want to make up for lost time, and that includes being there for everything, whether it's the good times or the difficult ones." Martha remained silent for a moment, reflecting on David's words. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, David. Let's take it one step at a time. I accept your presence, your support. But I want you to understand that there are some things I need to do for myself to feel, well, you know." David smiled, feeling relieved to see that at least she was willing to let him be part of her life. "Agreed. One step at a time." He paused before suggesting something that had been on his mind since he woke up that morning. "How about we take a trip, just the three of us, to relax a bit and enjoy this moment? I have a place in the countryside. It's calm, away from everything. We could spend a weekend there, just getting to know each other better and enjoying the time together." Martha seemed hesitant at first, but the idea of escaping the routine and spending time with her brother seemed tempting. She looked at Amanda, who had overheard part of the conversation and was now watching them with curiosity. "What do you think, Amanda?" Martha asked with an encouraging smile. Amanda, who until then had maintained a certain distrust toward her uncle, began to show interest. The idea of a trip seemed exciting, and the opportunity to spend more time with David, who was starting to become an intriguing figure in her life, attracted her. "I think it would be fun," Amanda replied timidly, but with a sparkle in her eyes. And so it was decided. The following weekend, the three of them met at David's property, a picturesque place surrounded by green hills and a tranquil lake. The country house was cozy, with large windows that let in sunlight and a spacious garden, where Amanda soon began exploring while David and Martha organized things inside the house. During those days, something began to change between them. David, who had always been a businessman, found himself laughing more, feeling lighter. He told stories of his childhood, many of which Amanda listened to with fascination, captivated by memories that seemed to belong to a distant world. "When I was little, your mother always took care of me," David said one night as they all sat around a campfire he had lit in the backyard. "She always defended me when things got tough at home. Martha was my hero, even though she was just a little girl." Martha laughed, though her eyes were filled with emotion. "You were always my little brother. And even after we were separated, I never stopped thinking about you, about how you were, about what your life might have been." Hearing all this, Amanda began to see her uncle in a new light. He wasn't just a wealthy man who had suddenly appeared. He was part of a story she had never fully known. She began to grow closer to him, asking about his business, about his life in general, and David, happy about this opening, answered with patience and affection. On the last day before they returned home, David took Amanda for a walk around the lake. They walked in silence for a while before Amanda finally spoke. "Uncle David," she began, a bit shy, "are you going to leave again? I mean, are you going to disappear like before?" David stopped walking and knelt down to be at her level. "No, Amanda, never again. I promise that I will always be there for you and your mother. I can't imagine living away from you now." Amanda smiled, still shy, but David saw in her eyes that trust was growing. He hugged her, feeling that little by little he was starting to rebuild the family he had lost. As they returned home, David realized that something inside him was changing. He felt a simple but profound happiness that he hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't the satisfaction that business success brought, but a genuine joy born from love and connection with those who truly mattered. That weekend in the countryside was more than just a trip. It was the beginning of a new life for David, Martha, and Amanda. And as they drove away from the property, leaving the countryside behind, David knew that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, by his family's side, rebuilding the bonds that time and distance had broken, but that were now finally being restored. The weeks after the trip to the countryside were filled with happy and meaningful moments for David, Martha, and Amanda. They were getting used to the new family dynamics, and David felt increasingly close to his sister and niece. However, this tranquility would soon be shaken by an unexpected return from the past. It was a Friday afternoon when Martha received a call that left her pale. On the other end of the line, a voice she hadn't heard in many years sounded familiar, and yet distant. It was Amanda's father, Charles, a man who had disappeared from their lives when Martha needed him the most. He was back in town and wanted to see them. "Martha, I know I have a lot to explain, but I'm here now. I want to see my daughter." Charles's words were loaded with a false tranquility, as if he expected everything to be easily forgiven and forgotten. Martha was paralyzed for a moment, holding the phone tightly. The anger she felt for him, abandoning her when she was pregnant with Amanda, mixed with a confusing sense of compassion, something she was reluctant to acknowledge. "Charles, you don't have the right to just show up after all these years," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Amanda already has another father figure in her life now," Charles insisted, asking for a chance to explain, and Martha, against her better judgment, agreed to meet him, but with one condition. He wouldn't see Amanda until she decided what was best for her daughter. Later that day, Martha told David about the phone call. They were sitting in her kitchen, and David immediately noticed the tension on his sister's face. "Charles is back. He wants to see Amanda." Martha's words came out almost in a whisper, as if she were confessing something shameful. David, who was serving a cup of coffee, froze for a second. He knew that Charles had been a problematic figure in Martha's past, but he didn't expect him to return so suddenly. "What does he want?" David asked, trying to remain calm but feeling a wave of concern growing inside him. "He said he wants to reconnect, be part of Amanda's life," Martha replied, without looking directly at David. She was nervously fidgeting with the napkin in front of her. "But I don't know, David. I don't know if I can trust him again. He left us when I needed him the most." David frowned. He had always been protective of his family, and Charles's return set off all the alarm bells in his mind. "Martha, I'll investigate. I need to know what he's been up to all these years before he gets anywhere near Amanda," David said decisively. He didn't trust Charles and wanted to ensure that his sister's and niece's safety wasn't compromised. Martha nodded, relieved that she didn't have to deal with this alone. She knew that David had the resources and contacts to uncover the truth behind Charles's return. As David began using his influence to investigate Charles's past, Martha had to deal with the whirlwind of emotions that his return had provoked. She remembered the man he had been, how they had dreamed of starting a family before everything fell apart. But the strongest memory was of being left alone, vulnerable, and pregnant, having to face the world with no one by her side. Now, years later, he wanted another chance, and Martha didn't know if she could grant it. Amanda, on the other hand, was confused. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she could feel the tension in the air. When Martha gently mentioned that her biological father wanted to see her, Amanda felt torn. Part of her wanted to meet the man who had been just a distant and nebulous figure until then, but she was also becoming increasingly attached to David, who now held a special place in her life. "Mom, what should I do?" Amanda asked one night after Martha put her to bed. Her eyes filled with uncertainty, reflecting the internal conflict that tormented her. "I don't know, my dear," Martha replied, holding her daughter's hand tenderly. "I want what's best for you, but I also want you to feel safe and loved. I don't want you to get hurt." Meanwhile, David's investigations began to reveal troubling information. He discovered that Charles had been involved in illegal activities during the years he had been absent. There were reports that he had problems with gambling debts and associated with dangerous people. David knew this made Charles a potential threat, and he wasn't willing to risk his family's safety. David confronted Martha with what he had discovered, and a major family argument ensued. Amanda, who had been listening to the conversation from the other side of the door, entered the room, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "What's going on?" Amanda asked, her voice trembling. Martha looked at David, who was clearly trying to control his anger, and then turned to her daughter. "Amanda, your father. He's not someone we can trust," Martha said, her voice choked with emotion. "He's been involved in bad things, and I'm trying to protect you." Amanda remained silent, trying to process it all. She knew her mother was telling the truth, but that didn't make the situation any less painful. She looked at David, who had become a figure of trust and affection in her life. "And you, Uncle David, are you going to stay with us?" Amanda asked, the uncertainty evident in her voice. David approached his niece and knelt beside her, holding her small hands. "Amanda, I will always be with you, no matter what happens. We are a family now, and I promise that no one will separate us again." David's words brought some comfort to Amanda, but she still felt torn. Part of her wanted to meet her biological father, even knowing he wasn't a good man. It was an internal battle between the desire to have a connection with her father and the need for security that she found alongside David and Martha. The chapter ended with this tension in the air, with painful truths being revealed and an uncertain future ahead. David and Martha knew they needed to protect Amanda, but they also needed to help her understand and deal with her own conflicting emotions and desires. The tense atmosphere of recent days hung over David, Martha, and Amanda like a heavy cloud about to burst. David, who had always been a man of action, knew he couldn't stand by and do nothing while Charles's dark past threatened the safety and newfound happiness of his family. He decided it was time to take definitive action. That morning, David called Martha to talk. They sat in the living room, the silence between them laden with worry. Martha looked at her brother, noticing the seriousness in his eyes. "Martha, we need to resolve this situation with Charles once and for all," David began bluntly. "He represents a risk to you and Amanda. I won't allow him to continue threatening the life we're building together." Martha sighed, feeling the weight of the decision that was approaching. She knew David was right, but part of her still struggled with the idea of distancing Charles for good, especially because of Amanda. However, the safety and well-being of her daughter were non-negotiable priorities. "What do you intend to do, David?" she asked, trying to remain calm. "I have contacts that can help us keep Charles away for good. I'll ensure he no longer has access to you, and any attempt he makes to reconnect will be legally blocked. This may mean he has to leave the city and remain under surveillance, but it's what needs to be done." Martha felt a mix of relief and sadness. She knew the decision was necessary, but it was still painful. Even so, she trusted her brother's judgment and knew he would do what was best for them. "If that's the only way to protect Amanda, then do what you must," Martha said firmly. David nodded, determined. He spent the following days making the necessary calls, using his influence to ensure that Charles was kept away from any attempt to contact Martha and Amanda. The exact details of what he did would remain a secret, but the result was clear. Charles received a firm warning that his presence was no longer welcome, and any attempt to resume contact would have serious consequences. Shortly after, he left the city, disappearing once again from the lives of Martha and Amanda, but this time for good. With that threat neutralized, David felt he could finally breathe a sigh of relief. However, at the same time, the weight of everything that had happened in recent months made him reflect on life and priorities. He knew there was more to life than business and financial success. His experience with Martha and Amanda had shown him the true value of family and caring for others. Inspired by Martha's life story, who had fought alone to raise Amanda, David began thinking about ways to give back to society. He decided it was time to do something meaningful, something that reflected the new phase of his life. Conversations with Martha about the past, about the challenges they faced, brought to the surface memories of his own childhood in the orphanage, and he couldn't stop thinking about the children who still lived in those circumstances without the hope he once had when he was adopted. David began getting involved in charity projects, starting with substantial donations to organizations that helped families in need and children at risk. He wanted to do more than just donate money. He wanted to be present, to be part of those changes. That's how one day David decided to visit an orphanage in the city. He remembered the place where he had spent part of his childhood, the children who, like him, were waiting for a new chance in life. Upon arriving at the orphanage, he was greeted by the director, a middle-aged woman with a welcoming smile, but whose eyes showed the harsh reality she faced daily. "Mr. Smith, it's a pleasure to have you here," she said, leading him inside. "I'm glad to see someone of your standing interested in our work." David smiled, but his expression was serious as he observed the facilities. The walls needed painting, the furniture was old and worn, and the children, though well cared for, clearly needed more resources and attention. "I want to help," David said directly. "I want to ensure these children have more than I had when I was in a place like this. Not just food and shelter, but opportunities. I want to fund improvements, but I also want these children to have access to education, extracurricular activities, everything they might need to have a better future." The director was visibly moved by David's words. She knew how much this would mean to the children in her care. "That would be incredible, Mr. Smith. We do our best, but it's difficult with limited resources. Your help could completely transform these children's lives." David nodded, feeling that he was on the right path. He spent the rest of the day at the orphanage, talking with the children, listening to their stories, laughing with them. Every smile he saw, every story he heard, reinforced his determination to make a difference. When he finally left the orphanage that night, David felt an inner peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. For the first time in years, he wasn't just filling the void with business and material success, but he was finding a true purpose, something that went beyond himself. The days that followed David's decision to support the orphanage marked the beginning of a new phase in his life. He felt he had finally found a purpose that went beyond business and financial success. Now he was committed to using his influence and resources to improve the lives of those who needed it most. Martha, inspired by her brother's determination, decided to join him in this mission. Together, they began planning and implementing a series of social initiatives aimed at helping vulnerable families, children in orphanages, and underprivileged communities. They established partnerships with various organizations and began expanding charity projects in different areas of the city. Amanda, who watched everything with admiration, also wanted to participate. With the support of David and Martha, she began getting involved in the projects, helping the children in the orphanages, and participating in community events. The young girl felt a growing pride in her family, seeing how her uncle and mother were making a difference in so many people's lives. At one of these community events, David was introduced to Charlotte, the director of one of the community centers he had started supporting. Charlotte was a strong and charismatic woman with a heart dedicated to social causes. As soon as they met, David felt an immediate connection with her. Charlotte, in turn, was impressed by David's sincerity and commitment to helping the less fortunate. Over the weeks, David and Charlotte began working together on various projects. Every meeting, every conversation strengthened the bond between them. Charlotte saw in David more than just a wealthy businessman. She saw someone who had found a genuine purpose in helping others, and that attracted her. For his part, David felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope in love. The time he spent with Charlotte was different from any other relationship he had had in the past. It wasn't just about physical attraction, but a deep connection based on shared values and the desire to do good. As David, Martha, and Charlotte continued to expand the charity projects, the relationship between David and Charlotte became closer and more significant. David felt rejuvenated, as if life was finally offering him a new chance at happiness, now based on love and compassion. The chapter ends with David and Charlotte saying goodbye after another day of work at the community center. When Charlotte turned to leave, David gently held her arm. "Charlotte, I know this may seem sudden, but..." David hesitated for a moment, her eyes fixed on his, encouraging him to continue. "I think I'm starting to feel something very special for you, and I'd like to know if you feel the same." Charlotte smiled, a smile that lit up her eyes and made David's heart race. "David, I feel the same, and I think we're just beginning something really beautiful." With those words, they exchanged a knowing look, aware that beyond their projects and the changes they were bringing to the world around them, they were also building a new story together. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, as David and Charlotte began dating. The relationship between the two blossomed naturally, nurtured by the shared work and passion they both had for helping others. Every new social project they undertook together strengthened the bond between them, and soon what had started as a professional partnership turned into something much deeper. David, who once felt lost and lonely, now found in Charlotte a constant source of joy and inspiration. She not only supported him in his philanthropic journey, but also challenged him to be the best version of himself. With Charlotte by his side, David experienced emotional growth he never imagined was possible. He became more open, more vulnerable, and at the same time more confident in his choices and feelings. Martha and Amanda quickly noticed the change in David. He was happier, lighter, and his relationship with Charlotte seemed to bring out the best in everyone around him. Martha, who had always been protective of her brother, couldn't help but smile at how much Charlotte was good for him. She supported the relationship wholeheartedly, knowing that David had finally found the peace and love he had long sought. Amanda, in turn, began to grow closer to Charlotte. For her, Charlotte became an additional maternal figure, someone she could trust and seek advice from. Charlotte treated Amanda with affection and respect, never trying to replace Martha, but complementing the mother-daughter relationship in a way that made Amanda feel even more loved and protected. As time passed, David began to seriously think about the future. He knew that Charlotte was the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with, and the idea of building a family with her filled his heart with hope and joy. In one of the many conversations they had at the end of a long day of work at the community center, David shared his feelings with Charlotte. "Charlotte, since you came into my life, everything has changed for the better," David said, holding her hands as they sat on a bench in a park after a community event. "I know it's early, but I can't imagine a future without you. I've been thinking a lot about this, and I'd like to build a life with you, a family. What do you think?" Charlotte smiled, a smile full of tenderness and love. "David, I feel the same. You have brought so much meaning to my life, and I also can't imagine being anywhere else but by your side. Building a family with you would be a dream come true." With those words, the decision was made in their hearts. David began planning how to propose to Charlotte, thinking of a moment as special as the love he felt for her. At the same time, he continued to dedicate himself to charity projects, now with an even clearer vision of the future he wanted to build, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. Meanwhile, Charlotte's relationship with Martha and Amanda continued to strengthen. Martha saw in Charlotte the sister she never had, someone she could count on for anything, and the two began sharing responsibilities in the social projects they led with David. Amanda, in turn, loved spending time with Charlotte, learning from her about empathy, generosity, and the importance of helping others. The chapter closes with a scene where the whole family, David, Charlotte, Martha, and Amanda, are together at a dinner at home, laughing and sharing stories. The atmosphere is warm and full of love, reflecting the new life David had long sought. He looks around the table, seeing the three most important women in his life, and feels a deep peace, knowing that he has finally found what he so desired, a family, love, and a purpose that fills every corner of his soul. The big day finally arrived. David and Charlotte decided to get married in a simple yet meaningful ceremony, surrounded by the people they loved the most, and who had been an essential part of the journey that led them to that moment. The chosen location was an outdoor garden, decorated with white flowers and soft lights that shone like stars at dusk. Amanda, wearing a little flower girl dress, was radiant. She carried a basket of flower petals and smiled with joy, knowing she was part of a special moment not only for her uncle, but for the whole family. Martha, standing beside her, watched everything with a mix of pride and emotion. Her brother, who had once been separated from her and lost in the world, was now there in front of her, about to begin a new chapter in his life. David, elegantly dressed, waited for Charlotte at the altar with a serene smile on his face. When Charlotte appeared down the aisle, dressed in white with a bouquet of delicate flowers in her hands, all eyes turned to her. But for David, at that moment, the whole world disappeared. He saw only the woman who had brought new light to his life, the woman with whom he was about to build a future full of love and purpose. The ceremony was touching, with sincere vows that brought tears to those present. When David and Charlotte exchanged rings, Martha couldn't hold back her tears. For her, this was the culmination of a journey of pain, overcoming, and finally, redemption. Her brother, now a transformed man, stood before her, happy and fulfilled, ready to live a full life alongside Charlotte. After the ceremony, while the guests celebrated, David called Martha for a private conversation. They walked away from the party and climbed a small hill where they could see the illuminated garden in the distance. "Martha, I wanted to talk to you about something very important," David said, looking at the horizon before turning his eyes to his sister. "Sure, David. What is it?" Martha responded, curious. David held Martha's hands, feeling the need to convey to her how much her presence in his life meant. "Martha, I've always known that when I found you again, I would do everything to ensure that you and Amanda would never have to worry about anything again. We've been through so much, and you've been so strong, raising Amanda on your own. Now that we're together again, I want you to know that you don't have to carry that burden alone." Martha looked at her brother, feeling the sincerity in every word. "David, you've already done so much for us. We're here today because of what you've done. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me, Martha. We're family, and that's what families do," David said with a smile. "I've decided to share my inheritance with you. I want to ensure that you and Amanda have everything you need and more. This is as much yours as it is mine. And I want you to know that I'm not doing this out of obligation, but because you are the most important people in my life." Martha tried to respond, but the words got caught in her throat. She just nodded as tears streamed down her face. David hugged her tenderly, feeling that in that moment they were more connected than ever. Back at the party, David and Charlotte danced under the lights, surrounded by friends and family. The atmosphere was one of celebration, but also of reflection on what was to come. David knew that the journey didn't end there. In fact, it was just beginning. After the wedding, David and Charlotte dedicated themselves even more to charity work. They expanded existing projects, founded new community centers, and ensured that resources reached those who needed them most. David, now more than ever, felt that he was fulfilling a greater purpose, one he could never have imagined before reuniting with Martha and reconnecting with his roots. Martha, for her part, used the portion of the inheritance that David had given her to start her own social project focused on helping single mothers in vulnerable situations, a reflection of her own history and struggles. Amanda continued to grow, surrounded by love, inspiration, and the example of generosity that her relatives provided. Time passed, but the legacy of David and Charlotte only grew stronger. Together they transformed countless lives and left an indelible mark on the community. More importantly, they built a family united by love, compassion, and the will to do good. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.